Yeah, if you look at our results, our shortfall is over 100% from iPhone, and it's primarily in Greater China.
Apple has gone and done something almost unprecedented. In a letter to investors, CEO Tim Cook announced Apple is revising its guidance for Q1 2019, lowering revenue projections from the previously stated 89 to 93 billion all the way down to 84 billion. That's an 8% difference, which translates into $5 to $9 billion. Yeah, ouch. Welcome back. Glad you could join me. I'm Rene Ritchie, and this is Vector. The last time Apple revised guidance down was a decade and a half ago, Q3 2002, before iPod became a runaway hit and before iPhone was even a purple project. It's not all bad news. Cook announced revenue for everything other than iPhone was up 19% year over year, including a record-setting $10.8 billion in revenue for services. Wearables, which is Apple Watch and AirPods, grew 50%, and new Macs and iPads Pro led to year-over-year revenue boosts for both of those segments as well. Apple still expects to report a new all-time record for earnings per share, and even with that terrible, no good, very bad earnings warning on iPhone, it's still almost certainly going to be Apple's second biggest quarter ever. But that terrible, no good, very bad earnings warning. According to Cook, there were 4 potential problems already baked into Apple's previous forecast. 1. Where iPhone X shipped in this quarter last year, iPhone XS and XR had both already shipped this year, meaning no launch bump and a tougher year-to-year compare. 2. The strong US dollar would hurt them in international exchange and reduce revenue growth by 200 basis points. 3. The sheer number of new products released towards the end of the year would result in supply constraints, especially for iPad Pro, Apple Watch, and MacBook Air, and also for AirPods. And 4. Economic weaknesses in some emerging markets. Cook claims the first 3 played out pretty much as Apple expected. The fourth one, though, well, that wrecked.
If you look at our results, our shortfall is over 100% from iPhone, and it's primarily in Greater China. And so as we look at what's going on in China, it's clear that the economy began to slow there for the second half. And what I believe to be the case is the trade tensions between the United States and China put additional pressure on their economy.
China was the last quote-unquote easy growth sector left for iPhone. After moving from AT&T to Verizon and all the US carriers and spreading across Europe and most of the rest of the world, after NTT Docomo in Japan, the biggest prize was China Mobile. And once Apple got that, there were no markets left to conquer. No quote-unquote easy markets, at least. But China has never really been that easy. It's a market that's second only to the US in terms of size and will one day be second to none. But it's also a very different market. Ben Thompson outlined Apple's advantage in China as the status-conferring brand, but also its risks. The fundamental issue is this: unlike the rest of the world, in China, the most important layer of the smartphone stack is not the phone's operating system. Rather, it is WeChat. In China, Apple is simply another smartphone vendor, and being simply another smartphone vendor is a hazardous place to be. To be clear, it's not all bad. In China, Apple still trades on status and luxury. Unlike the rest of the world, though, the company has to earn it with every release, and that's a bar both difficult to clear in the abstract and, given the last 2 iPhones, difficult to clear in reality. That the extent of the China shortfall caught Apple by surprise, though, even given the current volatility of both economies and regimes, is in and of itself surprising, though that's also likely indicative of a problem far beyond Apple and its earnings. Despite all this, Apple did manage to not only grow its install base in China, but also hit new records for services there, which could indicate brand loyalty and ecosystem are more nuanced in the market than popular analysis would have us believe.
In addition to the emerging market weakness, which is primarily in China, it's that there's not as many subsidies as there used to be from a carrier point of view. And where that didn't all happen yesterday, if you've been out of the market for 2 or 3 years and you come back, it looks like that to you. We've started a program worldwide where we dramatically lowered the battery replacement price.
Now, this is where the internet lost its collective freaking mind last night, with far too many people using the news to justify their own personal pet peeves. In other words, any particular decision they personally didn't like or agree with over the last decade was now proof positively coming home to roost. And I totally get it. We're human. If something doesn't bother us specifically, we have a real hard time understanding why it's any issue at all to anyone else. But if something does bug us, hot wow must it be the root of all evil, because we're all the centers of our own perfect little precious universes. But markets, like life, are usually just a little more complicated than that. So let's start with what Cook actually said. Now, there's been some criticism of how he handles these things, especially when compared to Steve Jobs' style. Here's probably the best example from John Gruber on Daring Fireball. I think Cook's genuine and inherent humility holds Apple back on days like today. Apple needed less, "I'm sorry, let me explain," and more, "F you, this is bullshit, let me explain." What people took away from Cook's letter and TV appearance today is that the iPhone laid a turd last quarter. Properly delivered, the takeaway should have been that China is crazy, but the iPhone is still kicking the shit out of the entire rest of the handset industry and is only pulling further ahead. John even took it a step further, laying out how a Jobs-style Cook "allow me to retort" could have played out. I typically argue that Cook's relative openness is better for customers and market analysis both, but given the inherent cynicism of most coverage, Cook's candor often gets dismissed as dissembly, while the outright lies of other CEOs get passed along as gospel. So who knows? What Cook is referencing first is that in a world with no subsidies, most people see the full sticker price of the iPhone, and that price is shockingly higher than ever. That's worth parsing out, because feels aren't facts and facts are important. A lot of people see Apple charging higher prices as putting profit ahead of market or customers. The truth is Apple isn't making iPhones more expensive. They're making more expensive iPhones. Everything from the OLED screens to the Face ID modules are more expensive than LCD and Touch ID, and the cost for other components like memory have gone up as well. Far from Tim Cook milking products, Apple margins have gone down slightly since the height of the Steve Jobs era, and Apple's margins are only high to begin with because almost no one else makes any money at all in the smartphone market. Apple could certainly have kept making less expensive iPhones or eaten even more gross margins to keep prices in line, but it's unclear if they would have made it up in volume or just have had to release the same or even greater downward adjustments anyway. My guess is that iPhone prices will drop again as the currently expensive new components scale and become the new normal. But it's unclear if Apple can solve for the US dollar strength, especially as it manifests in massive hikes in international iPhone prices, not without weaning themselves and Wall Street off the expectations of those margins, at least in the smartphone business. Customers taking advantage of reduced pricing for iPhone battery replacement is something else that's proven difficult to parse. Here's my take. In February of 2017, Apple had a problem with older iPhones shutting down when power demand spiked. To solve it, they began aggressively managing performance to prevent those power spikes. In other words, throttling speed to preserve longevity. But Apple never properly explained what they were doing. Slowdowns on older iPhones ended up being far worse than anyone, including Apple, imagined. No one realized that performance throttling was related to batteries, and people were justifiably outraged by the whole thing. In December, Apple announced a cheap battery replacement program. Before then, awareness of battery replacements was low and prices were high. After that, awareness skyrocketed and cost plummeted. So, some percentage of people chose to have the battery replaced on their old iPhones instead of buying new iPhones. Add to that iPhone X likely pulling some number of upgrades forward like iPhone 6 did in the past because it was so new and different. And on the flip side, some number of people who dislike change either sticking with their existing home button phones longer than they would have otherwise or electing to buy older, lower margin iPhones instead, and you have a smaller but just as perfect a storm in established markets as you do in China. It's nowhere nearly as big, at least right now, but because we're the ones in those markets, it's getting the vast majority of the coverage. And again, we're using it as an excuse to validate all our own pet peeves. But neither China nor the US, not trade or tariffs, not pricing or pet peeves really explain what's going on. Yeah, knee-jerk hot takes are easy and detailed analysis is hard, and I'd love to say you could just go over to Skillshare, find a course on how not to do terrible Apple or tech coverage, and knock yourself out. Hell, I'd love to point a bunch of people at it right now if I could, but I can't, at least not yet. The good news is Skillshare has just about everything else you could ever want to learn. Over 20,000 classes in design, business, technology, and more. Premium membership gives you unlimited access so you can get better at your job, get a better job, or just learn something that's not your job. Just visit the link in the description below and the first 500 of you get 2 months of unlimited access for free. Act now and start learning today. Thanks, Skillshare, and thanks to all of you for supporting the show.
We're also putting a lot of focus on the service side. Our stores are unbelievable at service.
So now, finally, here's the simple terrifying truth of all this. Complaints about pricing, price points, home buttons, headphone jacks, batteries, upgrade cycles, etc. are all totally valid, but are all also totally beside the point, which remains this. The smartphone market is now mature, beyond mature. What I've been writing about since at least 2010, and what I covered in a video just last month, and what many people have been saying, if not expressly mapping out for years, is something everyone, and not just Apple, now has to face. As much as conspiracy theorists love to say Apple builds in obsolescence, Apple has actually been not just building, but enacting the exact opposite: planned longevity. Everything from the higher priced iPhones that use hardware that just lasts longer and longer, and chipsets that are designed to provide overhead for a good half decade to come, to software like iOS 12, which is specifically focused on improving the performance of old iPhones going back 5 years. Apple is doing everything it can to keep people happy with their existing iPhones for as long as they possibly can. So why would Apple do something that looks so absolutely insane for their current balance sheet? For their future balance sheet. Because the biggest question remains this: can Apple transition iPhone from growth driver to platform that enables more growth drivers? There are signs that they can, that Apple actually understands the phone market is saturated and has for a while, that Apple spent a decade building up the iPhone, and now they know they need to spend the next decade using the iPhone to build up absolutely everything else. Apple will still sell new iPhones, of course, and thanks to the focus on longevity, older iPhones will get handed down and remain in use, which is why Tim Cook is stressing things like this. Our installed base of active devices hit a new all-time high, growing by more than 100 million units in 12 months. There are more Apple devices being used than ever before, and it's a testament to the ongoing loyalty, satisfaction, and engagement of our customers. Once you've sold everyone an iPhone, you start selling things to people with iPhones. Things like AirPods and Apple Watches and apps and subscription services. Exactly what Apple is still reporting record earnings for right now. What remains to be seen is how high and how fast that grows. And that includes things like music and TV shows, but also things like financial services on the back of Apple Pay and health services on the back of Apple Watch. There may never be another iPhone, at least not until we get to advanced wearables, if not cybernetics. iPhone was an outlier, something more valuable than companies that have oligopoly control of scarce fossil fuel resources. But when you take away the massive distortion that is iPhone, Apple still has numerous other highly viable businesses that almost any other company on the planet would give their top 2 executives to get a hold of. And unless and until we get to Apple Cybernetics, growing those businesses is the way forward. At least that's what I think. Now, I'd love to know what you think. Is Apple doomed, or doomed all the way to the bank? Hit like, hit subscribe, it really helps out the channel, and then hit up the comments and let me know. And thank you so much for watching.